Modern life is rubbish. That is kind of the sentiment that I've felt with like a lot of people uh, as of late and really for the past couple of years. Now, of course, if we're going to be honest, if we're going to be, like fair, people have always complained about the present state of society. I'm not saying it's like some novel, crazy thing. I'm also not coming here to act like I'm some kind of like genius or like I'm holier than thou. Like I don't think I'm smarter than really anyone else. I don't think I'm smarter than like the average person. I think I just maybe have different interests. So I like to do more research and maybe, you know, I'm very curious. I would say I'm a little bit more curious than the average person if I'm going to compliment myself. But, um, there's a general sentiment I find with people across the board. This isn't just, like regardless of what side of the political spectrum you're on, regardless of your philosophical views or your views on society, I think everyone can agree that there's something wrong. Of course, people are going to disagree on the specifics. People are going to disagree on what specifically is wrong. Um, but there's a general vibe of like unease in the air. And it's been like this for a little while. Although I would say that the coof definitely like exacerbated it severely. I was in my like sophomore year of high school when COVID started. I was literally like about to get my driver's license. It was literally the week we went into lockdown, at least where I'm at in Canada. The week we went into lockdown was the week I turned 16 years old. Yeah, and I was supposed to get my driver's license. I was already, I was gonna do all that. My dad was gonna take me. It was, on the weekend, and that never happened. And now I am 22 years old, and I still don't have a driver's license. Funny thing that. Um, and of course, part of that is my own personal laziness. Um, but that's just one example. And, I ended up doing a bit of research, as I like to do, on this subject. And it turns out I'm not the only one who doesn't have a driver's license. In fact, the number of, young men without driver's license has like something like quadrupled since the 1970s. There's a lot of different metrics that you could look into this. Like there was a specific study that was done of young men and maybe young women as well. It was things like, have you ever asked someone out on a date? Have you ever gone to a dance? Have you, worked a job, a part-time job? Have you had sex? All these different questions for young people. And when we compare it to, like less than 50 years ago, almost everything has gone down significantly. Drinking alcohol, even things like that have gone down. Things that I'm not even necessarily saying are healthy. And I also don't think that risky, crazy sex is healthy either. But I'm just giving you examples of things, right? That something has changed in our society, and it's a bigger subject for sure. And there's a lot of different aspects to it that we could go into, but there's a general sentiment that our modern world is boring. People are bored. Um, the people that do work, the people that are working, lots of people don't like their jobs or are doing things purely for the sake of, making their rent. Like, that's basically the only thing motivating them. A lot of people, they would quit their jobs if they had a better opportunity, but they have no better opportunities. The average person is essentially screwed by the system, by society, whatever you want to say. And of course, some people, people that are hardworking, people that are skilled, who I respect the hell out of, by the way, those sorts of people are able to, you know, find a better way. Those people are the ones who are investing, they're saving up their money, they're being very, very careful with how they spend their money. Those people are doing okay. And those people will do okay in most societies. Although I still think there's a limit to them. No one is perfect. And I think even those people have their limits. Now, if you live in a place like I do, in a suburb, then your day-to-day life is probably pretty boring. If you live in the countryside, it's probably like a better kind of boring. And if you live in the city, it's probably like a really chaotic, weird kind of boring. It depends on the city as well. Obviously, not all cities are the same. But there's, an undercurrent to modern life that is essentially all, derivative of city life. Everybody wants, certain things. And, people move to cities for that reason. People move to cities to experience new things, right? Some cities are on the rise. Some cities are on the decline, the very severe decline. There are cities in my country that are growing a lot, like Calgary, for example, or Edmonton. And then there are cities that are kind of a shadow of their former selves, like Vancouver, or even Toronto as well. Cities that are just simply not what they were 10 years ago, and people know it. And there are people that are in denial. If you go on a little bit of a website called reddit.com, you will find a lot of what I can only assume are Gen Xers or millennials who want it to be boomers really desperately, and who kind of like have like a boomer mentality and, very boomer political views on almost anything. These sorts of people, they exist in every country. Canada just has, they just have disproportionate power here. They have a veto that maybe they don't have in every country. Although I get the impression that in places like, Western Europe, places like Australia, it's not really that different to how it is here. Or even if you're in certain parts of the U.S., like if you're in like a blue state like California or New York or Massachusetts or whatever, it's probably a similar culture where, there is a certain type of person who is typically, upper middle class or, maybe even straight up rich, like upper class. And these people who, have good jobs, live in nice neighborhoods, can afford to send their kids to private school, they want to tell you, the worker, the blue collar guy, they want to tell you how great society is and why to stop complaining and why, you should be voting like this or voting like that. Not even to get super political, because to be honest with you guys, I don't really care about politics anymore. I think politics stopped being fun after COVID, and just became like sad and depressing. Like I don't really pay attention as much to current events as I used to. I get bits and bites of things from Twitter or from people bring it up, whatever friends bring it up. There's stuff here and there, but to be honest, it's like kind of not that interesting anymore. All I really know is that neither party is particularly interested in improving things. Both parties essentially want a slightly different version of the status quo, which is modernity, which is, modern life, which is, this kind of technocracy where, people are basically governed by, a small class of very wealthy tech people, we'll call them, right? People call them the tech aristocracy. Actually, I don't even know if did I make that term up or is that a common term? I actually don't know. But the tech aristocracy, who I'd like to make a whole video just about that subject, about these people who, more or less took over the world in the span of like 20 years. It is impressive, obviously. Now, when did modernity start? Well, that's actually kind of like a impossible thing to define, because, every modernity is always whatever is current, right? But I think when people talk about modernity, typically like in a philosophical sense, they're usually talking about like the Enlightenment or the age of exploration, colonialism, all that. So around like the 16th century. And then of course there's the, post-war consensus, and then there's what I like to call the post 9/11 consensus, which is kind of what we've been living on for a long time. This is when we started to get, smartphones, technology becoming basically the main thing, the main industry in society. That all started after 9/11. And of course, there was still, some semblance of the old world that continued to exist. Depending on where you live, there is still to this very day. But I think most people would agree that the 2000s were a major turning point. that was when you started seeing the popularity of social media like MySpace. You started seeing the widespread adoption of internet, computers, eventually smartphones. The decline in traditional media, things like that was all happened about within like 10 years, just in the 2000s. And it is kind of crazy how that worked. I mean, I'm talking mostly about North America here, but I think it was similar in most parts of the world. There was kind of a consistent thing. Anyways, these were just some thoughts, just kind of me thinking out loud. If you like this video, then you can give it a like if you want. You can subscribe if you want, and I guess let me know what your opinion is on this subject. I plan to make more videos like this in the future that are just these sort of like open stream of consciousness kind of stuff. So yeah, if you like that, then subscribe, and bye.